What is anxiety? Anxiety is a general term that refers to a basic feeling of nervousness, a worriedness. It can have multiple physical manifestations. There can be tightness in different body parts, often the chest, head, face. There can be shortness of breath. It's a feeling that we're all very familiar with from the youngest ages that we can even remember. And it's clearly an intentionally designed feeling that every single person experiences in the world. So when we talk about the feeling of anxiety, it's actually something that is a good thing for a person to feel. And the first part of what I want to talk about is, well, when is it good and when does it become a disorder? So anxiety, for positive purposes, is a feeling that we get in response to some type of potential danger. It usually is accompanied by some form of uncertainty. We're not sure what's going to happen next. Perhaps we've been invited to come speak for a Cheskenu organization, let's just say, and we're not sure what we're going to say and how we're going to say it and who's listening. And also, whenever you make a joke on these phone sessions, you never know if anyone really likes it because you can't hear anybody laughing or not. But either way, you might be asked to publicly speak. In fact, a famous comedian once quipped that a large percentage of people actually fear speaking publicly more than fearing death itself, which, as he quipped, would mean that that percentage of people would actually rather be giving the eulogy at the funeral than being the subject of the funeral, which is interesting. We have this fear of speaking publicly and many other areas of life, and it produces these feelings of anxiety, this same feeling of tightness in different areas of our body, shortness of breath, nervousness, worried, of the uncertainty. How's it going to go? What's going to be? It serves a tremendous purpose for us because it gets us to have a heightened sensory response to our given situation. The right level of anxiety will actually get a person to be extra alert and attentive to what he's saying when he speaks, for example, to where he's going when he's walking in the forest and he sees something large move in the distance. It will all of a sudden trigger a tremendous anxiety response, and that serves a great purpose for the person to have that adrenaline response where he can run, fight, and so on and so forth. In many different scenarios, there can be different responses, but it actually strengthens and heightens our abilities. Although in the process, if we actually are focused on what it's doing to us, it's somewhat of an uncomfortable feeling. However, it serves a tremendous purpose, as I'm mentioning in all these cases. So that's how anxiety is built into us as human beings, with tremendous design and chachma. But at the same time, imagine you're walking through that woods and there's no bear in the distance, and you're actually not walking through the woods, and you're just sitting in a chair where you should be relaxed, and instead of being relaxed, you're feeling as if there was a bear at the other end of that room. That can be quite troubling. Instead of it giving you the energy that you might need to run from something when there's nothing to run from, it's just giving you this rush of energy that actually is quite an uncomfortable feeling in and of itself. And that's where it begins to become an anxiety disorder, where we begin to become nervous or worried around either nothing or things that we shouldn't be nervous or worried about, but we have become nervous and worried about to the extent that we have a full or partial anxiety response to those stimuli, to those environments. So that's the basic idea of what an anxiety disorder is, and it's really troubling to people. There's something called general anxiety disorder, where there's no specific worry that the person might have. It's just an overall feeling of nervousness and worry that they kind of can't kick. No matter how much sleep they get, no matter how much exercise they do, no matter how much breathing exercises they do, and all these types of things, they just keep feeling that underlying nervousness and edginess, and they just can't get rid of it. And it could be so troubling. You know, imagine you go to sleep at night and you wake up in the morning looking forward to that refreshed feeling after a long good night's sleep that you once remember having, and instead you wake up still having that edge on. And it can be really troubling. Obviously, in all of these cases where there's some type of real disorder, it's important, and if there might be, it's really important to get individualized treatment with a professional therapist and to be diagnosed and to get the proper treatments. So I do want to go through some of what that might look like, again, to hopefully spark some questions in the minds of the listeners. And I want to start a little bit with beyond anxiety, one of the subsets of anxiety, OCD. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, actually is a subset of anxiety disorder, and it's more specifically related to when the compulsion was developed. So the O of the OCD, the obsession, is actually part of what a regular anxiety disorder might be. You feel nervousness or worriedness about any particular circumstance or situation that you recognize rationally you shouldn't, but you do, and the feelings are there. And it really is actually a chemical process in the brain where, I can give any person a shot of adrenaline or other chemicals and actually artificially make them feel anxiety. It's something which is an actual chemical hormonal response in the body. So they're feeling these things. The body's biologically producing these chemicals and hormones in situations where they're not warranted, as we mentioned. And that's the obsession. They're feeling that anxiety towards something that they shouldn't be feeling anxiety towards, and it's happening quite often, which makes it the D, the disorder. If it only happens once every 6 months for an hour, or once a year for an hour, we wouldn't call it a D, a disorder. It's not the biggest deal in the world, assuming it's not the most extreme thing we could imagine. But, it's an hour a year. That's okay. But once it's happening frequently and with intensity, it becomes the D, the disorder. What makes OCD unique is the C, the compulsions. What happens here is, again, there is research to support that this is something which also develops chemically in the brain. And there's actually a genetic component both to anxiety and to OCD as a subset of anxiety, as well as it can be environmental. These all play together. The C, the compulsion, is that the person now wants to calm him or herself down. So what they'll do is they'll do some type of activity. They'll have a compulsory act in response to that obsession that they got, and that's supposed to try to calm them down, and it does. And so much like trying to have a conversation with somebody who's addicted to drugs, to just stop, what are you doing? It's not good for you, and look how bad you feel afterwards. When they're faced with that drug and they're feeling so bad, it's not true. If I as a therapist would tell that person, don't take it, it's not going to make you feel good, I'm lying to them. That drug is going to make them feel all better really temporarily. And then it will make them feel much worse, and it will ruin their life for many reasons, etc. But it's not true that it's not going to have a pleasurable benefit to them, very, very short term and very short-sighted. So too, when it comes to the C of OCD, to that compulsion that the person might act upon, it actually is going to make them feel better very temporarily, much like a drug. And it actually, very much in the same way as a drug, is not just not ultimately going to help them and they'll be left where they started. It's going to make it actually worse for them if they engage in these acts. So let me explain with an example. Very common example, famous example, people are aware of, a person who is afraid of germs. Afraid of germs to the extent that, let's say, they need to wash their hands so many times a day that their hands start to bleed. So this is a good example of where the D comes in, because it's such an important letter, just as important as the other two. Say a person is afraid of germs and therefore they need to wash their hands one extra time a day, more than the average person. So not just before eating and after going to the bathroom, but one extra random time a day. Is that really going to affect their lives negatively? No. Question is that one extra time going to turn into 2, 3, 4, etc.? If it doesn't, that's fine. Let them go through their lives like that. Is it really bothering them? And if they do that, they're perfectly calm otherwise. There's no disorder there. But oftentimes the case when it comes to, well, always by definition when it comes to OCD, what's happening is that there's some type of disorder that's disrupting their lives. And so say in this case, for example, the person's washing their hands to the point of their hands starting to bleed and they can't stop. They want to stop. They recognize that they shouldn't be doing this. It doesn't really rationally make sense. Or That sometimes also is a tricky part of the treatment of OCD and anxiety. Sometimes you're not really sure does it make sense or not, but you're definitely not certain that it does make sense, if that makes sense. In other words, there's at least a part of you that realizes maybe I shouldn't be doing this. And obviously, when it comes to the point of really doing something that is not healthy for yourself, like washing your hands so much till they start to bleed, it can be pretty easily objectively determined that you should not be doing this. So what does that do for the person? What it does is that while they're obsessing and very worried irrationally about all the germs that might be on their hands, or every time they touch a doorknob, for example, they might have just gotten some lethal germs on their fingertips and hands, and they must take care of those germs. So the compulsion is going to come to play, and they're going to wash their hands. But it's going to happen so much, it's going to be bad for them. The compulsion actually does make them feel better temporarily. It soothes that worry, that nervousness, that anxiety temporarily. After all, they just wash their hands with soap. However, what it does paradoxically is it reinforces in the brain that there really is something dangerous and worrisome about touching doorknobs. Because after all, if there was nothing worrisome or dangerous about touching doorknobs, why would you wash your hands after each time that you touch the doorknob? It must be, and the brain does this all subconsciously, some call this cognitive dissonance, it must be that there is something dangerous and worrisome and dangerously uncertain about touching doorknobs. And it actually reinforces the obsession and turns into a vicious cycle. As the O affects the person obsesses about the germs, the C comes in to actually calm that obsession, and it does temporarily, but in that act reinforces the strength and intensity of the O, which comes back with even more intensity, thus needing the C again and more often, and so on and so forth. So it creates a vicious cycle. One of the best evidence-based treatments for OCD is something called exposure therapy. Exposure therapy is often misunderstood by people. Exposure therapy is not what we would think the next step in what I'm talking about is breaking the cycle. So, for example, just touch the doorknob a lot and don't wash your hands and force yourself not to wash your hands. Yeah, that might work. But at the same time, it's not actually treating the OCD. The client might be able to do that, to perform it and force themselves to perform it. And then you could say, wow, okay, look, you did it 100 times. That's not going to treat the actual OCD, because the OCD is something which is in affecting the mental cognitions, the thoughts of the person. And so if you're not doing the work within the thoughts of the person, you're not going to gain much, if anything. So, for example, while the person's doing this quote-unquote exposure work, they're thinking in their minds about the latest song that just came out and just singing it over and over and over and over again as they touch that doorknob, or thinking of some crazy picture in their mind as they're touching the doorknob over and over again, and then they got through it. That actually does nothing for them. What they need to be doing is thinking about how maybe there is some germs on this doorknob, and I have to live with that uncertainty. I had a teacher once who told me OCD can be paraphrased as follows. It's the quest for certainty and perfection in an unperfect world. We live in a world where there are always chances. Everything has a chance. And so if a person would argue with me, but there is a chance that I could die from touching that doorknob. Is there a chance? Yeah, a really, really, really tiny chance that's negligible and should be treated as negligible. And that's how you live a healthy life, by basically ignoring that chance and touching doorknobs. And so in attempting to basically clarify that certainty by washing your hands each time, when you clarify it and it damages you, it becomes that disorder. And the exposure treatment serves to force you to actually confront and face that uncertainty. What does facing an uncertainty do? Okay, fine. So I'll go through the exposure treatment. I'll touch the doorknob and I'll be thinking, which is really hard. But with the therapist's help, I'll be thinking to myself, while I'm doing it, there really might be germs here that could potentially kill me. But the chances are so negligible that it makes sense for me to do this. And I just have to tolerate that level of uncertainty. Okay, So what is it going to do for me as I continue to do that repetitively? And the answer is, if you're really maintaining that thought and not just doing it with distraction, which is one of the biggest challenges of exposure treatment, if you're doing it thinking that thought, that there really might be germs there, then it builds tolerance through something called habituation. Hergo, as they say. Habituation is the process that every human being experiences when we get into the car after driving for some years and we just arrive at our destination and we didn't even think about which turns to make and when to push the gas and the brake and all that. And it serves a tremendous purpose throughout our lives, allowing us to live our lives almost on autopilot at times. When we do things repetitively, we build tolerance and habituation to them. It becomes a habit. And so too, when you expose yourself to that specific fear of uncertainty enough times with enough repetitiveness, your brain becomes so used to that fear of uncertainty, it becomes less and less and less frightful. It's like a person who wants to overcome a phobia, which actually is very connected to anxiety in general. A phobia is when there's a fear of something very specific that the person doesn't want to do, and often it's categorized simply as a phobia when the person is rather just simply avoiding it, like they just won't drive over bridges. But it's very similar to OCD, and perhaps technically the same in terms of the obsession of, I fear driving over that bridge, and the compulsion of, therefore, I am not going to drive over that bridge. So where's the active piece in the compulsion? Well, when you make that left turn and go on a 10-mile long cut highway to get around the bridge, all of that is the compulsion towards the obsession, the avoidance of facing that fear of uncertainty. The exposure serves to habituate the person to that fear of uncertainty, and the fear becomes less and less and less. That is the crux of exposure treatment when it comes to OCD. So I would like to just point out here before I forget that there is an amazing book written by a guy named John Grayson called Freedom from OCD. I highly recommend it. He actually wrote it as like a self-help type of book, again, for people who have pretty severe anxiety and it's really harming their lives in multiple ways. I would strongly recommend reading that book, but doing it in the context of having a therapist working with you on an individual basis, because everyone's different. One of the amazing things that he recommends, just to give you a little bit more of an understanding of exposure treatment, is he recommends audio scripts, basically recording yourself thinking out loud, speaking into a recorder. Let's say in our example, this doorknob might have germs. Those germs potentially could kill me. And as I touch the doorknob, it's fearful. I'm frightened by those germs, but they potentially are there. The chance that they're there might be negligible, might be so small, but there's still a chance. There's still that uncertainty regarding it. And you listen to that over and over and over again while you touch the doorknob. It just helps you stay focused, because the natural desire of any normal human being will be to run away from that very stressful thought. But in fact, it's that repetitiveness, the repetitive exposure to that thought that actually serves to ultimately lighten the fear and adrenaline response to it. Let's just mention one other thing when it comes to this example. Say somebody says to the person, this will just serve to reinforce the point that I was making. Say somebody says to the person, and this also touches on if you are a family member of someone that suffers from anxiety and OCD, how can you help them? Well, if what they're going to be faced with is, like we said, a fear of uncertainty. So say the person is, again, afraid of touching that doorknob. So you, as a good brother or sister of this person or parent of this person, says to them, or child of this person says to them, I have a simple solution for you. Here's a pair of gloves. They're clean. I just washed them. Wear them all day and all night. It's amazing. You'll be able to open and close doorknobs whenever you want. So that's actually, based on everything that we said, we can understand that's actually making it much worse. And that's usually what happens when you do these types of solutions. And there's many more subtle types of solutions that can sometimes be tricky, that it's actually making it worse. Because what you're trying to do in that case is clarify the uncertainty as opposed to develop tolerance for the uncertainty. By wearing the gloves, I've clarified there's no more uncertainty when it comes to those germs, as opposed to repetitively exposing myself to that tiny chance of germs and ultimately building up tolerance and habituation towards that uncertainty. So by putting on those gloves, the brain says to itself, why do I need to be wearing gloves right now? It's not cold outside. It's not cold inside. What am I doing? And the brain resolves that dilemma with, it's really dangerous to touch a doorknob with your bare hands. And you're actually building and building and building the intensity and the strength of that OCD pattern. I chose OCD as the subset of anxiety to discuss all this because I think it's the clearest way in which we can discuss the basic concepts of how anxiety works and how to treat anxiety, but the same exposure treatment can be used for anxiety in general. Sometimes lighter anxiety can be treated with things as simple as relaxation techniques and ways to kind of just get out of that mode of thought. And that's always a great first place to start, both as a therapist and if you're trying to just help yourself a little bit. But when it comes to it not working and all the relaxation techniques are just not able to really work, then if a person has anxiety towards any specific situation, repetitively exposing themselves to that fear of uncertainty, which is what anxiety always is going to benefit that person greatly. It's just really hard work. Due to the fact that it's such hard work, I actually started here in Baltimore a small group for men struggling with anxiety and or OCD, and it has been a tremendous blessing to them and it's not meant to be as instead of individual therapy at all. It's just that especially when you're doing exposure treatment, although it has a tremendously high efficacy rate, and it really works, it's really hard to do and to maintain, as you can imagine, as I'm talking through it, and you start to think about different forms and expressions of anxiety and OCD. It can be really difficult to maintain and do. It's exactly the opposite of what you want to do. And it's really stressful for people. The higher the level of anxiety, the more stressful it will be. In these groups, there can be a lot of tremendous sense of encouragement and chizuk for the people in describing and discussing the struggles that they're going through to maintain the exposure treatment continuing. One last point that I want to mention. This is definitely applicable in yeshivas, which I often deal with guys in yeshiva. I deal with all different types of people, but a lot of times I deal with many guys in yeshiva. And this is often something that comes to play, and it's definitely something that's true for frum women as well. And that is, how do we know if a person this can be said a little bit differently than women, but I'll speak it out perhaps in the way that it expresses itself more for a man. How do we know if the person is, that's not true, it's equally for men and women. How do we know if that person is engaged in, are they engaged in anxiety or some type of OCD expression, or are they engaged in Yiras Shamayim? I mean, let's say somebody would go back in time and look at Rav Aaron Leib Steinman when he was a bacher, and they would see him learning all hours of the night and davening a long Shemona Esrei, and they would say, oh boy, that's like a big thing for Menalim nowadays, and there's truth to that. Like, notice which bacher is davening a really long Shemona Esrei, way longer than anyone else. That's a red flag, and it is a red flag. But how do we know if that person's maybe the next Gadol Hador? It's a really tricky question. How do we know? Maybe that person is just so fervent in what they're doing that it's not only healthy, but amazing. It's godless. So it's a very tricky question. And I think there are multiple things to look at there. But one of the main things that I think is important to look at is in discussing the topic with the boy and being able to tell with a certain level of chachma, is the boy being honest with you and honest with himself. But if we are able to tell that it's coming from a tremendous source of menuchas hanefesh, of a calmness inside, it's not a worriedness and a nervousness. It's tremendous satisfaction in what they're doing, feelings of love and connection to Hashem and to the Ribono Shalom that's driving all of it. That's a beautiful thing. But if what you find, and this is often the case when it's much, much different than everybody else, not always though, and this is why you have to be careful, but if it's more of a nervousness and a stressfulness and almost like the feeling of, if I don't do this, then what's going to happen to me? And if I don't do this, I can't relax, and I can't go to lunch, and there's a edginess and a stressfulness that is driving all of it, then it could be many things, and one of the things that it could be is anxiety/OCD, and has to be honestly looked at and checked into. It doesn't mean it for sure is, but certainly reinforces that red flag.